I woke up before sunrise, the cabin wrapped in darkness, the kind that makes every sound feel sharper. The air was cold and heavy, carrying the damp smell of wet wood and pine. I'd stayed in the cabin alone, tucked deep in the woods because I wanted quiet and isolation. I had thought I would enjoy the solitude, the kind that lets your mind stretch and rest. But as I lay there on the thin mattress, the quiet started to feel like pressure, like the forest itself was leaning in, watching. I forced myself to get up. My legs felt stiff and the wooden floorboards groaned under my weight. I reached for the flashlight on the small table, its beam cutting through the shadows. The cabin was small. A single room with a stove, a rickety table, a chair, and a bed. A small window faced the dense forest, and I could barely make out the outline of trees through the frost. I had planned to spend the morning hiking, but something told me to stay inside for a while, to wait, to feel the place before moving. That feeling only grew stronger when I noticed the front door. It was slightly ajar, though I was certain I had locked it the night before. I froze. My mind tried to rationalize. Maybe the wind had blown it open, maybe I had left it unlocked. But the cabin was deep in the woods, miles from anyone else. There was no reason for anyone to come here. I picked up a nearby stick, a branch I had dragged inside as firewood, and held it like a club, my hands shaking. The thought of being watched was now heavy in my chest. I couldn't see anyone outside, just the swaying trees. I checked every corner of the cabin, moving slowly, breathing quietly. Nothing. Everything was where it should be. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I remembered the map I had brought, showing the nearest road. It was miles away, a trail that wound through thick woods, but I could reach it if I had to. I felt a flicker of relief at having a plan, a place to go if things went wrong. I decided to make a fire in the stove to warm up and give myself some light. The wood was damp, and it took a while, but eventually flames licked the iron stove, filling the cabin with a weak orange glow. I sat close to it, staring into the flames, trying to calm my racing thoughts. The wind outside picked up, rattling the windows, making shadows dance across the walls. That's when I noticed it. A set of footprints in the thin layer of snow just outside the cabin door. They weren't mine. They were fresh, heading toward the back of the cabin, disappearing into the trees. My stomach dropped. I grabbed my jacket, shoving my phone into the pocket. No signal. Of course. I had expected this. The thought of walking out into the woods, leaving the safety of the cabin, terrified me, but staying felt even worse. I decided to wait, to watch. I moved the chair near the window, squinting through the frost. Hours passed slowly. Every sound, the cracking of branches, the rustle of leaves, made my heart jump. I tried to focus, to be rational. Maybe it was an animal, maybe someone had walked by, but every instinct in my body screamed that it was something else. Around noon, the sun broke through the clouds, weak and gray, casting pale light on the forest. I saw movement. A figure, hunched, moving carefully through the trees. It wasn't a person I knew, and I didn't recognize any features. I felt panic rising. My hands were shaking and my breath came fast. I considered leaving, running to the nearest road, but I didn't know if the figure was armed or how close they were. I went back to the stove, trying to look calm, trying to think. My mind raced. The forest was vast, but I was deep in it. I remembered something I had read once about survival. Stay calm, assess, plan, and conserve energy. I had to think like that now. I started moving things quietly, pushing chairs against the door, stacking firewood near the windows so I could see without being seen. Every movement made my heart thump. I felt completely exposed, but also like I had a chance to fight back if necessary. By late afternoon, the figure was gone. No footprints, no sign of anyone outside. My tension didn't ease, though. The thought of someone watching from the trees lingered. I paced the cabin, checking the doors and windows again, the floorboards creaking under my weight. Every little sound felt like an alarm. I realized that I hadn't eaten or drunk anything. My stomach ached, but I couldn't calm myself enough to make food. I drank some water, tried to eat a granola bar, but even that felt risky. I decided to leave the cabin at nightfall, hoping the figure would have gone. I packed a small bag, flashlight, water, a knife, some food. I left the stove burning low for light, carefully checking the door and the path outside. Snow had covered the footprints from earlier, giving me hope that the figure was gone. The forest at night was darker than I remembered, heavier. Every sound, the crack of branches under my boots, the whistle of the wind, echoed in the silence. I kept my flashlight low, moving slowly. I followed the trail the map indicated, trusting that I could reach the main road in a few hours. The thought of being on open road again gave me a strange sense of relief. Hours passed. My legs ached. My breath came in clouds, freezing in the cold air. The forest seemed endless, but I kept moving. At one point I stumbled, catching myself on a tree. I froze, listening. Nothing. Just my own heart thumping. I realized how close I had been to panicking, to letting fear take over completely. But I pushed on. Finally, after what felt like forever, I saw the lights of a car approaching in the distance. My pace quickened. Relief hit me like a wave. I stepped onto the road, waving my arms. The car slowed and a driver stopped. I explained quickly, barely coherent, that I had been in the woods alone, that I needed help. They nodded, offering warmth and water. I felt the tension in my body unraveling. I returned later with proper help to check the cabin. There was no one there, no signs of forced entry, just the footprints I had seen that morning. The feeling of being watched was gone, replaced by relief. I learned something crucial that day. Fear can make the mind imagine what isn't there, but it also sharpens instincts. Staying calm, keeping a plan, and taking measured actions saved me. Back in civilization, I slept deeply that night, safe in a bed, knowing I had faced the woods and walked through fear without letting it consume me. The cabin remained in my memory, not as a haunted place, but as a test of endurance, awareness, and survival. And though I didn't know who or what had left the footprints, I knew one thing. I could trust myself to handle the unexpected. It took time for the feeling of dread to fade completely, but it did. I learned to respect the woods, not fear them blindly. And I realized that sometimes the scariest things are not ghosts or monsters, but silence, isolation, and the unknown, and that facing them with careful thought and steady nerves is what makes the difference between panic and survival. It was early October, the air was crisp, and the leaves were turning in brilliant shades of orange and red. I had been looking forward to this weekend for months, a break from work, emails, and the constant noise of the city. The cabin sat at the end of a gravel road, almost hidden between thick pine and birch trees. The last mile was rough, and my small car rattled over the uneven stones, but I didn't care. I just wanted to reach the quiet. The cabin itself was older, wooden, and weathered, with a small porch that sagged slightly on the right side. The roof had a few missing shingles, and I had to step over a fallen branch to get to the door. The windows were dusty, and I could see the faint outline of old furniture inside. I had chosen it because it promised solitude, but the moment I stepped inside, I realized it was colder than I expected. Not just from the outside air, but a damp, musty chill that clung to the walls. I lit the small gas heater and unpacked my things, trying to ignore the faint creaks and groans of the cabin settling. The first night was hard. The wind outside howled through gaps in the walls, making shadows dance across the ceiling. Every now and then, a branch would hit the roof or scrape against the walls, producing a sharp crack that made my heart jump. I kept reminding myself that this was normal for an old cabin in the woods, but sleep came in fits. At some point, I realized that I hadn't heard another human voice for hours, and that alone was unsettling. The silence was heavier than anything I had expected. The second day, I decided to explore the surrounding area. There was a small trail that led into the woods behind the cabin, lined with thick undergrowth. I wandered for hours, noticing how the forest seemed to close in around me. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig under my boots made me tense. I tried to enjoy the solitude, the crisp air, and the crunch of leaves beneath my feet, but there was a nagging feeling that I couldn't shake. I told myself it was just nerves, nothing more. When I returned to the cabin that evening, I noticed something strange. The door latch was slightly off. Not broken, just shifted. I had locked it carefully before leaving, and there was no sign of forced entry. My stomach sank. I checked the windows. They were all closed, but the one in the kitchen seemed to have a faint scratch along the frame. I stared at it for a long time, but couldn't tell if it was new or just old damage. Still, I felt watched, though I couldn't see anyone. I tried to eat dinner, read a bit, and calm down, but every little noise, the creaking floors, the wind, even the sound of my own breathing made me jump. That night, the noises were worse. Not outside, but inside. The floorboards in the cabin didn't line up perfectly, and in some places, stepping on them produced a hollow, echoing sound. I kept hearing faint thumps, like something heavy being dragged across the floor above me, but I knew the cabin was only one story. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe an animal had gotten in, maybe the house was settling. But rational thoughts didn't stop my heartbeat from racing. I sat on the edge of the bed, flashlight in hand, listening, every nerve alert. Around midnight, the noises stopped, but the tension didn't. I finally forced myself to sleep, but even in dreams, I was aware of every small sound. When morning came, I checked the entire cabin. No signs of animals, no footprints in the dirt outside. Everything looked normal. But I knew that wasn't the full story. That day, I decided to explore the area further, going deeper into the forest. I found an old trail that led down to a creek. The sound of water was soothing, and I spent hours just walking along the edge, trying to shake the unease. Still, when I looked back toward the cabin, the trees seemed denser, the shadows darker, almost as if the forest itself was watching me. By the third night, my nerves were raw. I had spent the day chopping wood to keep the heater running and securing all the windows and doors, but I knew it wasn't enough. As the sun set, the forest went completely silent, no birds, no wind, nothing. The air felt heavier, colder. Around 9 p.m. I heard it, a slow, deliberate scraping noise coming from the back of the cabin. It wasn't fast, not frantic, but measured, steady, like someone was testing the door frames, the walls. I gripped my flashlight, heart pounding. I called out, but the sound only stopped when I did. I forced myself to check, moving slowly toward the back door. The porch was empty, no footprints, no sign of anyone. But the latch was again slightly off. My stomach turned. I wasn't imagining it. Something was wrong. I spent the night in the living room, sitting in a chair, flashlight ready, listening. Every sound made me jump. Around 2 a.m. I heard the thump again, this time from inside. My first instinct was to run, but I couldn't leave. I had no signal, no way to call for help. I sat frozen, trying to track the sound. The noise moved slowly across the floor, then stopped near the kitchen. I mustered the courage to stand, flashlight trembling in my hand, and checked. Nothing. The knife from my kitchen drawer was in my hand without me realizing it. I stayed awake until sunrise, too scared to sleep. When morning finally came, I made a decision. I packed my things quickly, leaving the cabin in a mess, and drove back down the gravel road. As I got closer to the main road, I glanced in the rearview mirror at the cabin. It looked calm in the daylight, almost peaceful, as if nothing had happened. But I knew better. I felt the unease that had been clinging to me the entire weekend, and I realized that the cabin had been hiding something in plain sight. Not ghosts, not fairy tales, just something about isolation, old buildings, and the way the mind reacts when it feels trapped and watched. A few months later, I returned to the area during a clear, sunny day. The cabin had been abandoned completely, no sign of life. A neighbor, an older man who lived a few miles down the road, mentioned that the previous owners had left suddenly, claiming the place felt wrong. That was all he would say. He shrugged and went back to his chores. The cabin, I realized, was never dangerous in a traditional sense, but being alone in such a confined, deteriorating space, surrounded by endless trees, was enough to make anyone feel like they were losing touch with reality. The fear wasn't supernatural. It was real, psychological, and suffocating. I never went back for more than a glance, and I never stayed overnight in a cabin alone again. Even now, years later, I think about that weekend. I remember the smell of old wood and damp earth, the sound of the wind rattling the shingles, the scraping that made my blood run cold, and the silence that pressed in on me until I could hardly breathe. It taught me a lesson. Sometimes the scariest thing isn't what's out there in the woods, it's the isolation, the unknown, and the mind's ability to turn ordinary creaks, shadows, and drafts into something terrifying. I still hike, still explore, but I always make sure I'm never truly alone in a place like that. The memory of that cabin stays with me, a quiet reminder of how fragile our sense of safety can be when the world around us is silent, watching, and utterly indifferent to our presence. That weekend didn't break me, but it left a mark. I carry it like a shadow when I'm in the wilderness, a reminder that even without ghosts, monsters, or fairy tales, fear can find you, purely through the real human experience of being isolated, vulnerable, and alone in a place that refuses to be controlled. And in that, I found clarity. Fear is natural, survival instinct is sharp, and the most important thing is to respect the environment and yourself enough to know your limits. That cabin didn't haunt me, it educated me. And in the end, leaving it behind, fully aware of its hold over me, was the only way to truly reclaim peace. I drove down the narrow dirt road, my headlights cutting through the thick fog that had settled over the forest. The GPS on my phone showed a winding path, but signal had been weak for miles, and by now I was relying mostly on memory and the occasional glimpse of reflective markers stuck into trees. The cabin was supposed to be isolated, a place to get away from everything, and that was exactly what I wanted. A weekend alone, no distractions, no people, just the forest and me. The last turn came suddenly. A fallen tree partially blocked the path, forcing me to swerve around it. My tires crunched on loose gravel as I followed the narrow trail, which soon opened into a small clearing. The cabin stood there, smaller than I imagined, surrounded by tall pines whose tops disappeared into the fog. The paint was peeling and the wood looked gray and old, but the structure was solid. It had a small porch with a crooked railing, and I could see an old, rusted lantern hanging by the door. There was no smoke from a chimney, no sign of recent life. Perfect, I thought. Exactly what I wanted. I parked my car and grabbed my backpack, shoving the door shut behind me. The air was cold and damp, carrying the scent of wet pine needles and decomposing leaves. I carried my flashlight inside, clicking it on and sweeping the beam over the interior. Dust covered the floorboards and cobwebs hung from the corners of the ceiling. The cabin had a single room with a small kitchen area, a wood-burning stove, and a worn sofa pushed against one wall. A narrow staircase led to a loft where I assumed a mattress waited. Everything was quiet, almost too quiet. No birds, no rustling animals, nothing except the distant sound of water trickling somewhere beyond the trees. I unpacked my things, set down a small bag of groceries, and lit a fire in the stove. The warmth was welcome, but the shadows it cast made the corners of the room feel deeper and darker. I told myself it was just the old beams and furniture, that the cabin wasn't doing anything strange, it was just old. As night fell, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and whistling through cracks in the wood. I closed every curtain and door, tried to settle in with a book, but I couldn't shake a sense of being watched. Every creak of the floorboard sounded louder than it should. I forced myself to laugh at my own nerves. "It's an old cabin," I whispered, though no one was there to hear it. Around midnight, the wind shifted. It wasn't just wind anymore. There was a faint thumping outside, something dragging across the forest floor. I froze, listening, trying to convince myself it was a fallen branch or an animal. But the sound persisted, slow and deliberate, moving around the cabin. I wanted to peek through the window, but every instinct screamed to stay put. My hands trembled as I gripped the flashlight and pushed my ear to the door. The sound stopped. Then a soft scratching at the window. Not light, like leaves brushing against glass, but heavy, deliberate scratching. I backed away and fumbled for my phone, but as usual, no signal. The forest was completely isolated, and I realized how foolish I had been to come here alone without telling anyone exactly where I was. My heart was pounding. The scratching began again, now at the door. I pressed myself against the wall, listening. It was steady, patient, like whatever it was had been waiting for me to notice. Hours passed like that. Every shadow seemed alive. Every creak of the floorboards outside made me jump. I didn't dare look at the windows. The wind died down and the forest fell silent again. I tried to sleep, but every rustle outside made my stomach twist. I told myself I was imagining things, that maybe a raccoon or a deer was nearby, but the sound of dragging, heavy thumps and scratches didn't match anything I had ever heard in the woods. Morning came gray and cold. I opened the door slowly, half expecting to see tracks, half hoping I wouldn't. The ground was soft from overnight rain, and there were footprints around the cabin. Not small ones, large, heavy prints like boots. They had a spacing that suggested deliberate pacing, circling the cabin. My stomach dropped. Whoever or whatever had been outside wasn't an animal. I scanned the trees. Nothing. No one. But the prints were too clear to deny. I decided to leave, but my car was blocked. A fallen tree had shifted overnight, leaning against the front of my vehicle. Panic rose. I grabbed a small hatchet from the corner of the cabin and tried to push the tree, but it wouldn't budge. That's when I noticed the marks on the porch. Deep gouges, fresh, like someone had tried to pry the boards apart. Whoever had been circling the cabin had tried to get in. I realized I couldn't wait for someone to come. There was no one for miles. I grabbed my backpack, taking only essentials: food, water, my phone, the flashlight, and the hatchet. I tried to follow a trail back through the woods, but the fog had thickened again and every step felt heavier, like the forest was closing in. Branches scratched my arms, roots tripped me, and the mud sucked at my boots. Every few minutes I thought I heard footsteps behind me. I didn't dare turn. Hours passed. The forest seemed endless. Hunger and exhaustion began to set in. At one point I stumbled into a shallow stream and fell, soaking my clothes. I lay there for a moment, shivering, and considered giving up. But then I remembered the cabin, the prints, the scratching. I couldn't go back. Something out there had been circling, watching, waiting. I had to keep moving. Finally, in the late afternoon, I broke through the trees and saw a dirt road. Relief flooded me. I ran until my legs burned, finally reaching a small country road where a truck passed by. I waved frantically and the driver stopped. He was a middle-aged man with a tired face, but when I told him I had been lost in the forest near the old cabin, he nodded seriously. "You're lucky," he said. "Not many people come out of that part alone. A couple of guys live near there and they're not nice. They wander around the woods sometimes." He gave me a ride to the nearest gas station and I called the authorities. They went to check the cabin, but by the time they arrived there was no one there. The footprints and marks had disappeared, as if whoever had been there knew I had left. That night, in a motel room with hot shower water and lights that didn't flicker, I realized how lucky I had been. The cabin had been isolated, peaceful in appearance, but danger had been close the entire time. The forest had hidden it, the fog had concealed it, and my own caution had almost failed me. I went to sleep fully clothed, backpack beside the bed, phone in hand. Weeks later, I learned that the cabin had been used by a group of people who sometimes hunted and threatened anyone who stumbled into their territory. No one had ever been caught, and the authorities were mostly warnings. I couldn't stop thinking about how close I had come, how my life had depended on noticing the small signs, the footprints, the scratches, the careful pacing around the cabin. It was terrifying, but it also taught me to trust instincts, to respect isolation, and to never go somewhere unknown without a plan. I never went back to the cabin, but the memory stayed vivid. Even now, I can close my eyes and picture the fog, the dark windows, the feeling of being watched, and the cold realization that danger doesn't have to be supernatural to be real. Sometimes the scariest things are just ordinary people hidden in plain sight and the wilderness that hides them. I had been driving for hours on a narrow, winding road surrounded by dense pine forest. The sun was starting to sink low behind the trees, and the light had turned a dull orange, making the forest look even darker. I had rented a small cabin for a weekend getaway, somewhere far from the city, far from anyone, to be alone with my thoughts. I wasn't looking for adventure, just a quiet place to read, think, and get away from everything. The cabin itself was small and older, set back from the road by a gravel driveway that was half covered in fallen leaves. The wood had started to gray, and the shingles on the roof looked like they had weathered several harsh winters. It had a little porch with a rocking chair, a chimney, and windows with peeling white paint. It wasn't fancy, but it had a rustic charm. The isolation was what drew me here. The reviews online had made it sound peaceful, almost serene. I parked my car and carried my bags inside. The interior smelled faintly of old wood and mildew. The floorboards creaked under my weight, and the fireplace in the living room had ashes from a fire that hadn't been cleaned in a while. I placed my bags down and walked through the small cabin, noting the kitchen with old appliances, a single bedroom with a worn mattress, and a bathroom with a slow-draining sink. Everything looked functional, if a little neglected. After setting up, I decided to take a walk around the cabin. The forest was thick, with trees that seemed impossibly tall and dark. The wind rustled through the branches, making strange shadows on the ground. I felt a twinge of unease, but I told myself it was just the isolation playing tricks on my mind. I kept walking, exploring the area around the cabin. I found a small creek running a few hundred feet away and noticed animal tracks in the mud. Most looked like deer, but some were harder to identify. I snapped a few pictures with my phone and headed back inside as the light faded. That evening, I decided to make a fire in the fireplace. I found some old dry wood stacked in a corner and set it up carefully. When the fire caught, the cabin instantly felt warmer and more comfortable. I sat in the rocking chair with a blanket, listening to the fire crackle, and read my book until the shadows outside grew long and indistinct. That's when I first noticed the sound, faint but distinct. A scraping, dragging noise coming from somewhere outside. At first I tried to ignore it. Maybe it was an animal. Maybe it was the wind pushing something across the gravel driveway. I tried to concentrate on my book, but the sound kept coming, slow and irregular, like someone was dragging a heavy branch or bag across the dirt. I went to the window and peered outside, but the darkness had swallowed everything beyond the porch light. Nothing moved. I shrugged it off and went to bed, locking the door behind me. But the sound didn't stop. It grew louder, more deliberate, and sometimes it paused only to start again moments later. My heart started to race. I told myself it was probably an animal, something big like a raccoon or a deer, maybe a bear even. But the sound didn't feel random. It had a rhythm, like someone moving slowly around the cabin, testing the doors or looking for something. I tried to sleep, but I couldn't. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind made me jump. Around 2 a.m. I woke to the sound of footsteps on the porch. Heavy, deliberate steps moving back and forth. My stomach dropped. I didn't have a gun. My phone had 1 bar of service, but calling for help felt futile. I stayed as still as I could, holding my breath, listening. The steps stopped, and for a moment there was silence. Then a knock. Hard, quick, and then another. My pulse jumped into my throat. I could feel sweat on my back. Whoever it was, they knew I was inside. I considered running, but I had nowhere to go, no lights outside, nothing but trees and darkness. I grabbed a kitchen knife from the drawer, holding it in front of me, trying to steady my shaking hands. The knocking stopped as suddenly as it had started. I stayed awake for the rest of the night, listening to the forest, waiting, fearing every sound. The morning light never felt so welcome. When the sun finally broke through the trees, I slowly opened the door and stepped onto the porch. Nothing. No footprints. No signs of anyone. Only the normal marks of wildlife. I let out a shaky breath and decided I needed to leave, but when I went to start my car, it wouldn't. Dead battery. Of course. The isolation of this place felt suffocating now. I walked down the driveway, hoping for a signal, hoping someone would drive by. The road was empty, just as I had expected. The dragging sound from the night before returned in my mind, and I couldn't shake it. I went back to the cabin, figuring I'd at least pack my things and wait for someone to pass. That's when I noticed something I hadn't seen before. The back door, which I was sure I had locked, was slightly ajar. Not wide open, just enough to let someone slip in if they wanted. My stomach sank. I went inside cautiously. Nothing appeared disturbed, no signs anyone had been in the main areas. But on the floor near the kitchen, there was a faint, muddy footprint, human size. Someone had been here, likely in the night, and had left no other trace. My fear intensified, but at the same time, a strange clarity settled in. I couldn't panic. I had to act. I gathered my things quickly, locked what I could, and went to the small shed near the cabin. Inside, I found a rope, an axe, and some old tools. I took the axe and held it tightly, feeling a small measure of control return. By noon, a car finally passed on the road. I waved my arms, shouting until they pulled over. The driver, a local who had noticed my frantic gestures, listened as I explained the situation. He agreed to let me follow him to town and even offered to help me deal with the cabin later. I left without looking back, the forest and the cabin behind me. Later, I learned that the previous tenant of that cabin had reported break-ins, thieves who targeted remote locations. No one had ever been caught. I realized I had been lucky. The isolation that had drawn me here had also made me vulnerable. The fear, the helplessness, and the realization that someone had been moving around my temporary home in the dark would stay with me for a long time. But I also learned that clear thinking, preparation, and patience were what saved me. The fear was real, but by staying calm and taking action, I made it out safely. I never returned to that cabin, and I never will. But that weekend changed me. It made me aware of how easily comfort and solitude could become dangerous, how quickly a peaceful place could turn threatening. I still remember the sound of those footsteps and the scraping on the porch, and I still feel a shiver when I picture that cabin in my mind. I learned that fear doesn't have to be supernatural to be real. It can be simple, quiet, and deadly, just human, just alone, and just waiting for you to make a mistake. By the time I reached my own home, I was exhausted but relieved. I spent the next few days organizing my life, installing extra security measures, and making sure I never left a window unlocked again. The cabin, the forest, the footsteps, they became a cautionary tale in my mind. And while I had wanted solitude, I realized that safety is more important than adventure, and that some places are best left untouched. That clarity, that survival, was the best ending I could have hoped for. I remember the drive up to the cabin clearly. It was late October, the trees already half bare, their branches scratching against the wind like skeletal fingers. The GPS kept insisting I was going in the right direction, but every mile further into the forest felt wrong. The road had narrowed into a single dirt track, rutted and muddy, with puddles that reflected the dim gray sky. I kept glancing at my rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone or something following me, but there was nothing. Only the sound of my tires splashing through puddles and the low hum of my car engine. When I finally saw the cabin, I felt a moment of relief. It was a small wooden structure, weathered and darkened by years of exposure. The windows were grimy and the front porch sagged under its own weight. A thin trail of smoke rose from the chimney, and I assumed someone had been here recently. I parked on the uneven ground and stepped out. The air was sharp and cold, the kind that stings your lungs when you take a deep breath. The forest pressed close around me. The trees were so thick it felt like the world ended just beyond the clearing. Inside, the cabin smelled of damp wood and old pine. Dust coated the corners and floorboards, and there were signs that it hadn't been used in a while. Cobwebs draped from the ceiling beams, and a chair lay on its side as though someone had abandoned it in a hurry. I unpacked my bag slowly, noticing the silence that seemed almost physical, as if the air itself had weight. It was one of those silences that presses against your eardrums, making every creak and groan of the cabin feel amplified. I decided to light a fire in the old stone fireplace. The wood was dry enough to catch after some effort, and the warmth spread slowly through the room. Shadows leapt along the walls as the flames flickered, and for a moment I felt comforted. But the quiet outside never lifted. The wind whispered through the cracks in the windows, carrying faint sounds that were almost like footsteps. I told myself it was just the forest settling. Night fell faster than I expected. I had planned to sleep in, but unease kept me awake. Every so often I would hear it, a scraping sound outside just at the edge of the clearing. Something was moving between the trees. I tried to convince myself it was a deer or some small animal, but there was a deliberate rhythm to it, a weight that suggested something bigger. My imagination ran wild, painting pictures of figures lurking just out of sight. Around midnight, the sound became more persistent. Heavy thuds against the side of the cabin, deliberate and spaced in a way that matched a human stride. I froze. My mind raced, calculating what I should do. I could leave, but the car was far enough down the track that it would take 15 minutes to get to it, and every second I imagined someone or something watching from the treeline. I grabbed the largest stick I could find, my heart hammering, and slowly moved to the door. Peering out, all I saw was darkness, the trees like black silhouettes against a dim sky. Nothing. Then I noticed the footprints in the mud leading up to the cabin. They were large, human-shaped, but irregular. Whoever had walked here had taken care not to leave much evidence. But the ground was soft and their weight pressed deep. I realized the smoke from the chimney wasn't from a fire someone had lit earlier. Someone could have been here tonight watching me. The thought made my stomach turn. I retreated back inside, locking the door, but the pounding didn't stop. It moved around the cabin now, scratching and banging against the walls and roof. I could hear it climbing on the porch, the planks creaking under the weight. Panic surged, but I forced myself to think. There was a side window broken but covered with a thin wooden shutter. I could see enough to know that someone had been circling the cabin. I remembered the emergency signal on my phone. The forest was too dense for a strong GPS signal, but I could still send a message. My fingers shook as I typed, "Help. Cabins on Forest Road 17. Someone outside. Call police." I sent it, praying the weak connection would go through. The phone buzzed almost immediately with a weak confirmation from the network. Relief surged, but it was tempered by the fact that I had no idea how long it would take for anyone to arrive. Hours passed, or at least it felt like hours. The pounding faded as the night dragged on, but the unease never left. Every shadow seemed alive. Every crack of a branch outside felt like a signal. I stayed close to the fireplace, keeping the fire alive as best I could, holding the stick like a weapon even though I doubted it would do much. The wind howled outside and the trees groaned, making it hard to distinguish natural sounds from human ones. Finally, as dawn broke, a helicopter noise drifted through the forest. It was faint but unmistakable. My relief was immediate and raw. I ran outside, waving my arms as the sound grew louder. Moments later, 2 park rangers appeared, guns drawn, cautious, scanning the forest. I explained quickly, pointing to the footprints and describing the noises. They checked the perimeter carefully and found signs of someone having been near the cabin, but there was no one in sight. Whoever had been there had vanished overnight. The rangers stayed until the area felt secure. They escorted me back to my car, explaining that cabins in that part of the forest were sometimes targeted by people looking for isolation to hide. They suspected that the intruder had been using the cover of night to move unseen, and I realized how lucky I was. If I had fallen asleep or panicked earlier, the outcome could have been far worse. Driving away, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following me, but there was only the forest. The sunlight caught the tips of the bare trees and the sky had cleared, almost serene. I felt a mix of exhaustion and relief, and a strange gratitude for the ranger's presence. It was a clear reminder that nature is beautiful, but isolation can be dangerous if you're unprepared. Looking back, I can see now that fear had sharpened every sense. The creaks, the wind, the darkness, they all became warnings. I had learned, painfully, the importance of preparation and caution. Even the smallest detail, a loose shutter, a faint footprint, a broken branch could signal danger if you pay attention. By the time I reached the main road, I felt a weight lift off me, replaced by a clarity I hadn't had before. I realized that fear isn't just something that happens to you, it's something that teaches you to survive. That cabin is still out there, quiet now, its dark silhouette fading behind me. But the memory of that night remains vivid, etched in the way I notice sounds, shadows, and movements even in safe spaces. I don't think I'll ever go back there alone, and I certainly don't take isolation lightly anymore. That experience was terrifying, yes, but it ended with me alive, clear-headed, and infinitely more aware of how fragile a sense of safety can be when you're completely alone in the wilderness. I had been driving for hours on a narrow, winding road surrounded by dense pine forest. The sun was starting to sink low behind the trees, and the light had turned a dull orange, making the forest look even darker. I had rented a small cabin for a weekend getaway, somewhere far from the city, far from anyone, to be alone with my thoughts. I wasn't looking for adventure, just a quiet place to read, think, and get away from everything. The cabin itself was small and older, set back from the road by a gravel driveway that was half covered in fallen leaves. The wood had started to gray, and the shingles on the roof looked like they had weathered several harsh winters. It had a little porch with a rocking chair, a chimney, and windows with peeling white paint. It wasn't fancy, but it had a rustic charm. The isolation was what drew me here. The reviews online had made it sound peaceful, almost serene. I parked my car and carried my bags inside. The interior smelled faintly of old wood and mildew. The floorboards creaked under my weight, and the fireplace in the living room had ashes from a fire that hadn't been cleaned in a while. I placed my bags down and walked through the small cabin, noting the kitchen with old appliances, a single bedroom with a worn mattress, and a bathroom with a slow-draining sink. Everything looked functional if a little neglected. After setting up, I decided to take a walk around the cabin. The forest was thick, with trees that seemed impossibly tall and dark. The wind rustled through the branches, making strange shadows on the ground. I felt a twinge of unease, but I told myself it was just the isolation playing tricks on my mind. I kept walking, exploring the area around the cabin. I found a small creek running a few hundred feet away and noticed animal tracks in the mud. Most looked like deer, but some were harder to identify. I snapped a few pictures with my phone and headed back inside as the light faded. That evening, I decided to make a fire in the fireplace. I found some old dry wood stacked in a corner and set it up carefully. When the fire caught, the cabin instantly felt warmer and more comfortable. I sat in the rocking chair with a blanket, listening to the fire crackle, and read my book until the shadows outside grew long and indistinct. That's when I first noticed the sound, faint but distinct. A scraping, dragging noise coming from somewhere outside. At first I tried to ignore it. Maybe it was an animal. Maybe it was the wind pushing something across the gravel driveway. I tried to concentrate on my book, but the sound kept coming, slow and irregular, like someone was dragging a heavy branch or bag across the dirt. I went to the window and peered outside, but the darkness had swallowed everything beyond the porch light. Nothing moved. I shrugged it off and went to bed, locking the door behind me. But the sound didn't stop. It grew louder, more deliberate, and sometimes it paused, only to start again moments later. My heart started to race. I told myself it was probably an animal, something big like a raccoon or a deer, maybe a bear even. but the sound didn't feel random. It had a rhythm, like someone moving slowly around the cabin, testing the doors or looking for something. I tried to sleep, but I couldn't. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind made me jump. Around 2 a.m. I woke to the sound of footsteps on the porch. Heavy, deliberate steps moving back and forth. My stomach dropped. I didn't have a gun. My phone had 1 bar of service, but calling for help felt futile. I stayed as still as I could, holding my breath, listening. The steps stopped, and for a moment there was silence. Then a knock. Hard, quick, and then another. My pulse jumped into my throat. I could feel sweat on my back. Whoever it was, they knew I was inside. I considered running, but I had nowhere to go, no lights outside, nothing but trees and darkness. I grabbed a kitchen knife from the drawer, holding it in front of me, trying to steady my shaking hands. The knocking stopped as suddenly as it had started. I stayed awake for the rest of the night, listening to the forest, waiting, fearing every sound. The morning light never felt so welcome. When the sun finally broke through the trees, I slowly opened the door and stepped onto the porch. Nothing. No footprints. No signs of anyone. Only the normal marks of wildlife. I let out a shaky breath and decided I needed to leave, but when I went to start my car, it wouldn't. Dead battery. Of course. The isolation of this place felt suffocating now. I walked down the driveway, hoping for a signal, hoping someone would drive by. The road was empty, just as I had expected. The dragging sound from the night before returned in my mind, and I couldn't shake it. I went back to the cabin, figuring I'd at least pack my things and wait for someone to pass. That's when I noticed something I hadn't seen before. The back door, which I was sure I had locked, was slightly ajar. Not wide open, just enough to let someone slip in if they wanted. My stomach sank. I went inside cautiously. Nothing appeared disturbed, no signs anyone had been in the main areas. But on the floor near the kitchen, there was a faint, muddy footprint, human size. Someone had been here, likely in the night, and had left no other trace. My fear intensified, but at the same time, a strange clarity settled in. I couldn't panic. I had to act. I gathered my things quickly, locked what I could, and went to the small shed near the cabin. Inside, I found a rope, an axe, and some old tools. I took the axe and held it tightly, feeling a small measure of control return. By noon, a car finally passed on the road. I waved my arms, shouting until they pulled over. The driver, a local who had noticed my frantic gestures, listened as I explained the situation. He agreed to let me follow him to town and even offered to help me deal with the cabin later. I left without looking back, the forest and the cabin behind me. Later, I learned that the previous tenant of that cabin had reported break-ins, thieves who targeted remote locations. No one had ever been caught. I realized I had been lucky. The isolation that had drawn me here had also made me vulnerable. The fear, the helplessness, and the realization that someone had been moving around my temporary home in the dark would stay with me for a long time. But I also learned that clear thinking, preparation, and patience were what saved me. The fear was real, but by staying calm and taking action, I made it out safely. I never returned to that cabin, and I never will. But that weekend changed me. It made me aware of how easily comfort and solitude could become dangerous, how quickly a peaceful place could turn threatening. I still remember the sound of those footsteps and the scraping on the porch, and I still feel a shiver when I picture that cabin in my mind. I learned that fear doesn't have to be supernatural to be real. It can be simple, quiet, and deadly, just human, just alone, and just waiting for you to make a mistake. By the time I reached my own home, I was exhausted but relieved. I spent the next few days organizing my life, installing extra security measures, and making sure I never left a window unlocked again. The cabin, the forest, the footsteps, they became a cautionary tale in my mind. And while I had wanted solitude, I realized that safety is more important than adventure, and that some places are best left untouched. That clarity, that survival, was the best ending I could have hoped for. I remember the first time I went to that cabin like it was yesterday. I had driven for hours down winding, barely maintained forest roads, the kind where even GPS loses signal, and the sun was already starting to drop behind the thick line of pines. The air smelled different the closer I got, damp, earthy, and a little metallic, like wet iron in the soil. The cabin itself was tucked into a small clearing, far enough from the road that it felt like it belonged to the forest rather than humans. It was older, wooden planks grayed and warped from decades of weather. I had rented it for a solo retreat, thinking I needed a few days away from the noise of the city to clear my mind. When I pulled up, the first thing I noticed was how quiet it was. Not just the lack of cars or people, but an almost oppressive kind of quiet that pressed down on you. The trees absorbed sound, and even the wind seemed muted. I unpacked my car slowly, deliberately, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling settling in my chest. Every step on the wooden porch creaked under my weight. The cabin door opened with a reluctant groan. Inside, it smelled like old wood, pine, and something faintly sour, maybe mold. The interior was sparse but functional. A small kitchen with basic utensils, a wood stove, a table, and 2 chairs. A single bedroom with a bed and a thin blanket. I dropped my bags and wandered around, letting my eyes adjust to the dim light streaming through the dirty windows. Everything looked lived in once, but abandoned for a while. Dust coated the corners, and a few spiderwebs stretched across the ceiling beams. That night, I lit a small fire in the stove and sat down to eat a cold sandwich. The forest outside was nearly pitch black, and the faint sound of rustling leaves carried through the walls. I told myself it was nothing, probably raccoons or the wind, but I couldn't shake the sense that something was moving closer. I tried reading, but the shadows from the fire seemed to shift unnaturally. Eventually, I gave up and went to bed, leaving the window cracked just a little to let some air in. Around 2 in the morning, I woke to a faint sound. It wasn't loud, just a subtle scraping, like someone dragging something across the forest floor outside. My first instinct was to tell myself it was the wind, but it was too rhythmic, too deliberate. My heart started to race as I lay in bed, listening. Then came another sound, a low thump against the side of the cabin. Not a big bang, more like something heavy being pressed against the wall. I froze, straining to hear. The scratching continued, moving slowly around the corner of the cabin. My mind ran through every possible animal. Bear, deer, raccoon, maybe a porcupine. None of them made sense. I stayed frozen, gripping the blanket until the sounds stopped. But the tension didn't go away. I couldn't sleep, so I finally got up and grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen. The batteries were weak, flickering as I shined it over the cabin's exterior. Nothing. Just trees, shadows, and darkness so thick it seemed like the night itself had weight. I walked around the perimeter slowly, listening. Nothing moved, nothing breathed, nothing alive, but my instincts screamed that I wasn't alone. By the next morning, I tried to rationalize everything. Old cabins creak, the forest is full of animals, the wind can make noises. I told myself I was just being paranoid, imagining things in the darkness. I spent the day hiking nearby trails, trying to shake the lingering tension. Even in daylight, the forest felt different. The silence pressed in differently when the sun was out, and I noticed every little detail. A branch snapping too quickly, leaves rustling without wind, and the occasional glint of sunlight reflecting off something metallic in the underbrush. That evening, I returned to the cabin, determined to cook a proper meal and relax. I filled the stove with wood, started the fire, and unpacked some food. But as I cooked, I noticed something strange. The back door, which I was certain I had locked that morning, was slightly ajar. My stomach dropped. I locked it again and checked every window and door. Nothing seemed disturbed inside. No footprints, no broken locks, nothing. Still, the unease didn't leave. I spent the night on edge, checking the perimeter several times, feeling like I was being watched. The next morning, I found a clue that made my blood run cold. A line of footprints outside, partially obscured by fallen leaves, leading around the cabin in a semicircle. They were large, heavy, and unmistakably human. My heart pounded as I traced the prints with my eyes. They weren't random, they stopped at the edge of the tree line, like whoever had made them had been waiting, watching just beyond the clearing. I realized I had underestimated the isolation. There were people out there lurking, possibly observing. For the next day, I barely left the cabin. I didn't feel safe even stepping outside. I boarded up windows as best I could, moved heavy furniture near doors, and kept the stove fire burning for light and comfort. Every sound outside made me jump: the snap of a branch, a distant howl, the rustling of leaves. I started keeping a small knife on me at all times. I knew running wasn't an option. The forest was dense, and if someone was out there, they could catch me easily. On the third night, the tension broke. Around midnight, I heard the door handle jiggle. Not slowly like last time, but with a violent force. Someone was trying to get in. My heart threatened to leap out of my chest. I grabbed the knife, crouched low, and waited. The handle stopped moving, and the cabin fell into silence again, but I knew it wasn't over. I waited until the first faint light of dawn before I dared look outside. When I did, I saw it clearly. Footprints leading to the cabin and back out into the forest, disappearing into the dense undergrowth. Whoever it was hadn't entered but had circled the cabin, possibly testing, watching. My first instinct was panic, but then clarity hit me. I couldn't stay there. Not another night. I packed quickly, taking only essentials, and left before the sun was fully up, driving as fast as the winding roads allowed. Every turn, every shadow felt like a threat, but I refused to look back. I didn't stop until I reached a small town an hour away. I reported the incident to the local sheriff, explaining the footprints, the noises, and the strange presence. He listened, nodded, and told me that sometimes people squat in abandoned or rented cabins, watching visitors for days, testing them. He said it wasn't common, but it happened. Hearing that explanation didn't terrify me as much as it reassured me. There was a rational reason for everything I had experienced. No ghosts, no magic, no fairy tales, just someone very human, very real, and very dangerous. I haven't gone back to the forest since. The experience stayed with me, a constant reminder of how vulnerable isolation can make a person. The cabin was never haunted and no one confronted me directly, but knowing someone had been watching, maybe following, maybe waiting, it changed the way I think about being alone in the wilderness. I learned to respect it, to never underestimate it, and to always carry a plan to leave. Even now, years later, I can close my eyes and see that cabin in the clearing. The warped wood, the dark windows, the silence that pressed down harder than anything else I've ever felt. And I can still hear the faint scraping in my mind, a reminder that sometimes fear doesn't come from the supernatural, it comes from knowing someone else is out there, and that even when you survive, the memory never really leaves you. I had always liked the idea of escaping the city for a few days. The constant noise, the unending traffic, the people always in a hurry, it all felt suffocating after a while. So when I found a small, secluded cabin online, I jumped at the chance to rent it. It was somewhere deep in the woods, at the end of a dirt road that curved and twisted until it seemed to disappear entirely into the trees. The pictures made it look perfect. A tiny, rustic cabin with a stone fireplace, a small porch overlooking a clearing, and nothing around for miles. I told myself it would be peaceful. The drive out was long. My car rattled over the uneven dirt road, and at times I had to slow down to almost a crawl to avoid potholes that could swallow a tire hole. The forest on either side was thick, the trees tall and dark, their branches intertwining so densely that the sun barely touched the ground. I kept thinking about how easy it would be to get lost if I wandered off the path. When I finally arrived, the cabin looked even smaller than in the pictures, but there was something cozy about it. I parked, grabbed my bag, and stepped onto the porch. The air smelled like wet earth and pine. I could hear birds somewhere deep in the woods, but nothing else. It was quiet in a way that made the silence almost loud. Inside, the cabin was small but tidy. There was a table, a couple of chairs, a tiny kitchen corner with a stove and a sink, and a single bedroom with a worn bed. A wood stove sat in the corner of the living area. The previous tenants had left firewood stacked neatly by the wall. I set my bag down and decided to take a walk around the clearing before unpacking. The woods were beautiful but unnerving. Every step I took on the soft ground made a loud crunch, echoing in the stillness. I kept expecting to see someone or something, but there was no one. Birds flitted overhead, but they seemed to avoid getting too close. The further I walked, the more I noticed how thick the underbrush was. Branches clawed at my jacket, and roots threatened to trip me with every step. I realized I had no cell service. The idea of being completely cut off from the world hit me with a sudden, cold weight. I shrugged it off, thinking I had come here for solitude anyway. I returned to the cabin, locked the door, and started a small fire in the stove. The first night passed without incident. I read, drank coffee, and listened to the wind rattling the cabin. The second day, I decided to explore a trail I had noticed the night before. It was narrow, barely a path, leading deeper into the forest. I followed it, thinking it might lead to a creek or some other scenic spot. Hours passed, and the forest grew denser, the trees closer together. I began to feel trapped. The sunlight filtering through the canopy shifted quickly as the day progressed, and shadows grew long and strange. That's when I first noticed the tracks. At first, I thought they were just animal tracks, maybe deer or a raccoon. But they were too big and oddly shaped, with uneven spacing. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, there was nothing in these woods that could hurt me, right? but a chill ran down my spine. I didn't see any other footprints, no signs of other humans. Just those tracks, leading deeper and deeper into the darkening forest. I turned around, intending to head back, and realized I wasn't entirely sure which way I had come. Panic started to set in. I retraced my steps slowly, careful not to stumble over roots or rocks, but the forest seemed to shift around me. Every tree looked like one I had passed before, and every shadow seemed to stretch and twist unnaturally. My heart pounded. By the time I finally found the cabin, the sun had almost completely set. I slammed the door behind me and leaned against it, breathing heavily. I told myself I had overreacted, that I had probably walked in circles and convinced myself of something that wasn't there. But the unease lingered, gnawing at the back of my mind. That night I slept fitfully. Every sound, branches scraping against the cabin, a distant thump, even the wind made me jump. Around midnight I woke to a noise outside. It was soft at first, like a branch snapping, but then I heard it clearly. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, circling the cabin. My stomach dropped. I didn't open the door or look outside. I stayed frozen, clutching a flashlight and a knife I kept in my bag, just in case. The footsteps stopped abruptly. Silence followed. I stayed awake, tense, until the first light of morning. When I finally peered outside, there was no one, nothing. No footprints. No signs of anyone having been there. My rational mind told me I had imagined it, but deep down I wasn't so sure. The next day I tried to distract myself by doing chores around the cabin. I cleaned, stacked firewood, and ventured only a short distance into the woods for water from a nearby stream I had found. But every rustle in the trees, every snap of a twig made me flinch. I felt like I was being watched, like the forest itself was holding its breath. By the third night, the sense of dread had grown unbearable. I sat by the stove, flashlight in hand, listening for anything unusual. Around midnight, I heard it again, the slow, measured footsteps outside. But this time there was something different. A faint scratching at the door, deliberate and persistent. My hands shook as I grabbed the knife and edged toward the door. I took a deep breath and forced myself to look outside. The clearing was empty. There were footprints, fresh and wet in the mud, circling the cabin in a perfect loop. Whoever or whatever had done this had been close enough to touch the cabin walls. My mind raced with possibilities, and none of them were comforting. I decided I couldn't stay another night. I packed my bag silently, careful not to make a sound. At first light, I started the car and drove out as fast as I dared on the bumpy road. Every turn, every dip in the dirt road, I felt my pulse in my throat. The forest seemed to press in around me as if it were trying to hold me back. When I finally reached the main road, civilization and cell service, relief washed over me like a wave. I called the rental company and explained I was leaving early. They didn't seem surprised. Apparently, it wasn't the first time someone had cut their trip short there. I never went back to that cabin. I haven't told anyone the full story. Most would think I was overreacting, but I know what I experienced. Sometimes I still drive past that area, far enough to feel the forest at a distance. And I can't shake the memory of those footsteps circling the cabin in the dark, patient and silent. I've learned to trust my instincts now, to respect the quiet of the woods. Some places aren't meant for comfort or solitude, no matter how picturesque they look online. Some places are just alive in a way that you don't understand until you've felt it pressing against you in the dark. And I'll never forget that cabin, or the sound of footsteps that weren't mine, circling me in the night. I remember the first time I drove up to the cabin. It was tucked far back into the woods, deeper than I'd ever gone on my own. The GPS signal faded long before I reached the dirt road that led to it, leaving me to follow a narrow, twisting path that felt more like a trail than a proper road. The trees leaned in on either side, their branches scratching against the roof of my car, and the late afternoon sun filtered through them in jagged slashes. By the time I pulled into the clearing, the sky had started turning a muted gray, and the cabin looked smaller than it did in the pictures, more weathered, more isolated. It had a kind of quiet weight to it, like it had been waiting for someone, or maybe like it had already seen too much. The first night was just the usual unease of being alone somewhere so removed from civilization. The walls creaked as the cabin settled, a sound I tried to tell myself was normal. Outside, the wind rattled through the trees, and the occasional snap of a branch made me jump. I unpacked my things slowly, trying to convince myself that nothing was out of place. But even as I lay in bed, the dark outside the window seemed almost liquid, pressing against the glass in a way that made me feel trapped and exposed all at once. The next morning I explored. The cabin sat on the edge of a small ridge, overlooking a shallow valley covered in brown grass and sparse trees. There was a creek not far down, water murky and moving faster than I expected. I spent a long time walking the perimeter, noting that the windows all had locks that didn't seem very secure. The place had been abandoned for a while. Dust collected in corners, cobwebs stretched between beams. Even the furniture was thin and brittle, nothing that could take much weight. It gave me the feeling that the cabin wasn't just old but neglected, left to weather itself into decay. It was the third night that things started to feel wrong. I woke in the middle of the night to a sound like the door creaking open, slow and deliberate. At first I told myself it was the wind, that it had caught on something outside. But then I heard the faint scrape of something moving across the floorboards below me. I froze, listening. Every instinct screamed at me to stay still, to pretend I didn't hear it, but the sound continued, a soft shuffling, almost like someone dragging their feet. I grabbed the baseball bat I had leaned against the wall and waited, heart hammering, ears straining. Eventually the sound stopped and I convinced myself it had been an animal, a raccoon maybe, or a deer stepping on a branch. Sleep didn't come easy after that, every creak and whistle of the wind putting me on edge. By the fourth day I had decided to spend some time exploring the woods around the cabin. The trail behind the cabin led deeper into dense forest, paths twisting and doubling back on themselves, the trees thick enough that you couldn't see the sky. I wandered for hours, noting the uneven ground, the roots that threatened to trip me, the occasional drop that wasn't visible until you were almost over it. I found old rusted cans and remnants of a fire pit, signs that someone had been here before long ago. But it wasn't the artifacts that unnerved me, it was the silence. Birds avoided this area, or maybe it was just the time of year, but there was no sound of life beyond my own footsteps and breathing. Even the wind seemed to move differently, slower, almost deliberate. When I finally returned to the cabin, the sun had started to drop again, casting the woods in long, dark shadows. That night I heard it again. Not the same faint shuffle from before, but something louder, more deliberate. A knock at the window. I froze. It wasn't soft like a branch or the wind, it was solid, sharp. My heart skipped and I crept to the corner of the room where I could peek without being seen. Nothing. I listened. And then I heard it again, a scratching like nails dragging across wood. I felt the panic rising, my mind cycling through possibilities: animal, intruder, tree branch, but nothing made sense. The sounds weren't consistent with anything natural. I grabbed my jacket and flashlight, thinking I'd confront whatever it was, but when I opened the door, the night air was cold and empty. Not a sound, not a movement. I checked around the perimeter with the flashlight, shining it across the clearing, the trees, even down to the creek. Nothing. By the time I went back inside, my hands were shaking. I tried to tell myself it was paranoia. I repeated that phrase over and over. You're alone. You're fine. You're imagining it. But the next morning, evidence appeared. A branch outside, broken and snapped near the window where I had heard the first knock. Footprints in the soft dirt that hadn't been there before. They weren't large, but they were human. Someone had been outside during the night. I stayed inside for the next 2 days, blocking the windows as best I could with furniture and old boards I found in the shed. I didn't leave except to go to the creek for water, always scanning the woods, always hearing the faintest of noises that might be someone moving just beyond my sight. On the 5th night I made a plan. I couldn't stay there anymore. The feeling of being watched had become suffocating. I packed a small bag with essentials: food, water, my flashlight, a map, and waited until the stars were obscured by clouds, hiding me in darkness. I left by the back trail, careful to avoid the main clearing where the footprints had been. My pace was quick, deliberate, my eyes constantly scanning. The woods felt alive with movement, every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made me jump. I kept imagining a figure darting behind a tree waiting for me, but I didn't stop. I ran when I had to, crawled over fallen logs when my legs couldn't carry me faster, followed the creek downhill as a guide. My lungs burned, my hands scraped on bark and roots, but I couldn't stop. I kept hearing noises behind me, footsteps, faint at first, then growing louder. I didn't look back. Hours later, I reached the edge of a dirt road. I could see the faint lights of a town in the distance, hear the hum of cars. Relief hit me like a wave, and I ran the last stretch, waving my arms to catch the attention of the first passing car. They stopped, eyes wide, and I practically collapsed into the passenger seat, giving them a brief, frantic explanation. They nodded, understanding without questions, and drove me to the nearest police station. I reported the cabin, the footprints, everything, but by the time officers arrived, there was no sign of anyone. Just the cabin, empty, quiet, isolated again. In the weeks after, I stayed with friends, took extra precautions, and avoided the woods entirely. The memory of that place stayed with me, not just the fear, but the knowledge that it had been real, that someone could be there watching, patient and careful, leaving only traces to make you doubt your own mind. The cabin itself became a symbol for me, a reminder that some places are meant to be left alone, that the silence of the woods isn't always comforting, and that isolation has a way of amplifying every sound, every shadow, until it becomes almost impossible to know what is real and what is not. Eventually, I found a small apartment in town, the kind of place where you can see neighbors, hear the traffic, and feel grounded in a life full of ordinary sounds. I still think about the cabin sometimes, not because I want to go back, but because it taught me something about fear, about vigilance, and about trusting your instincts even when everything seems calm on the surface. I never returned, and I never will, but I keep the memory clear in my mind. A story I tell myself to remember that some places have a way of reaching into you long after you've left. I woke up to the sound of the wind rattling the thin wooden walls of the cabin, a constant creak that seemed to echo through the empty forest surrounding me. I had come here alone, thinking I wanted some peace, away from the chaos of the city and the constant noise of people. The cabin was small, barely large enough for a single room, a loft, and a tiny kitchen area. Everything inside smelled faintly of wood smoke and damp pine, the kind of smell that sticks to your clothes and skin if you stay too long. I had been here for a day, enough time to explore the small clearing outside, notice the thick, tangled forest around it, and see the narrow dirt path that led down to a creek. It was beautiful in a quiet, untouched kind of way, but beautiful didn't mean safe. That morning, I had woken early before the sun, and the forest was dark and heavy with mist. I had gone outside to fetch water from the creek, the cool metal bucket clanging against the rocks. The mist curled around the trees, making them look like shadowed giants, and the forest seemed to hold its breath. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling that had been gnawing at the back of my mind. I told myself it was just the isolation, the stillness. People weren't meant to be alone in places like this, not for long. Back at the cabin, I set the bucket down and tried to get a fire going in the stove. I had brought wood from the small pile outside, but when I tried to light it, the flames sputtered and refused to catch. I finally managed it with some dry kindling, the fire crackling and warming the air just enough. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the small room, listening to the wind outside. Every now and then, a branch would scrape against the cabin like fingernails on wood. I told myself it was normal, the sounds of the forest, but my stomach clenched anyway. Around mid-morning, I decided to check the perimeter of the cabin. The forest had been eerily quiet since I woke up. No birds, no rustling of small animals, just the wind and the distant roar of the creek. I followed the path that led to the back of the cabin where the trees were thickest. The ground was uneven, roots twisting and snapping underfoot. I felt watched, a prickling at the back of my neck that I couldn't explain. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was imagining it. Then I saw the first sign that something wasn't right, a set of footprints in the damp earth. They were large, heavy, and too far apart for a small animal. I froze, my heart racing. The footprints led from the tree line toward the cabin and then disappeared near the side of the house. I didn't see anyone, didn't hear anything, but the fear that had been simmering all morning erupted like a sudden flame. I checked the doors and windows. Everything was locked, everything looked normal, but the footprints remained in my mind, vivid and accusing. I went back inside, tried to focus on normal tasks, checking supplies, fixing the fire, but every sound made me jump. By late afternoon, the weather had changed. Clouds rolled in heavy and dark, and the wind picked up. Rain began to fall in steady sheets, pattering against the roof, and I watched the water pool around the cabin. I thought about leaving, about walking back down the trail to my car, but the forest seemed endless, the trail winding and confusing. The thought of stepping outside made my chest tighten. I tried to distract myself by cooking a small meal, but even the sound of the flames crackling made me tense. Every snap a reminder that I was not alone. As evening fell, the forest grew darker and more oppressive. I decided to climb to the loft to try to get some rest. The small ladder creaked under my weight, the loft itself narrow and low, the mattress thin and rough. I lay down and stared at the ceiling, listening to the rain, listening to the wind. And then I heard a noise that didn't belong. A slow, deliberate scraping coming from outside the cabin. At first, I thought it was a branch in the wind, but it was too rhythmic, too purposeful. Someone or something was moving around the outside of the cabin. I held my breath, straining to listen. The rain masked some of the sound, but I could hear it moving along the side, the scraping of wood against wood, something being dragged. My mind raced. I had my phone but no signal. I had a knife in the kitchen, but that felt useless against a stranger who could easily break in. I remembered the footprints from earlier and realized with a cold dread that they hadn't been a coincidence. Someone had been here watching, and now they were circling the cabin. I stayed frozen in the loft, trying to make sense of what to do. Panic clawed at my chest, but I forced myself to breathe, to think. I remembered the small trapdoor in the floor of the loft, used for storing firewood. It was narrow, cramped, but it led to a small crawl space beneath the cabin. I decided to move. Carefully, silently, I opened the trapdoor and slid down into the darkness. The crawl space was tight, dust motes dancing in the faint light from the loft above. I lay flat, holding my breath, listening. Hours seemed to pass. The scraping stopped at some point, and the cabin was silent except for the rain. I couldn't tell if they had gone or if they were simply waiting. Morning light eventually filtered through the cracks in the cabin walls, and I knew I couldn't stay hidden forever. I waited until the rain slowed, then carefully emerged from the crawl space, listening intently. The footprints from before had multiplied. Whoever had been here had left more signs, moving around the cabin, checking for entry points. But now, in the light, the forest seemed emptier. I realized they had left, probably frightened by the storm or by my unexpected movements. I spent the next hours packing the bare minimum: water, food, and my bag. I stayed alert, moving only when I could see clearly. The forest still felt oppressive, but daylight gave me confidence. I followed the creek down, using it as a guide. The forest floor was slippery from the rain, roots and rocks threatening to trip me at every step. I moved as quietly as I could, constantly glancing behind me. I saw no one, heard no one, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Eventually, the trees began to thin. The creek widened, and I recognized the path I had taken the day before. After hours of careful walking, I reached the dirt road that led to the main highway. My heart felt like it would burst, the tension of the night finally breaking as I saw cars pass in the distance. I flagged down a passing truck, and the driver, surprised and worried, agreed to take me into town. I left the cabin behind, the memory of it sharp in my mind. When I finally reached the safety of the small town, I realized how close I had come to something I couldn't have easily explained. It wasn't ghosts or monsters, it was real people, real threats, and the forest had amplified every fear I had. The cabin, beautiful and isolated, had been a trap in its own quiet way. I never went back. I sold my equipment, never took another trip alone, and made sure to always check in with someone when I went into the wilderness. I learned something important that day. Isolation can make small dangers feel enormous, and the forest, no matter how peaceful it seems, hides more than just wildlife. It hides people, and people can be unpredictable, dangerous, and silent. I carry that memory with me, not as a ghost story but as a warning: the world is beautiful, but it can also be quietly terrifying, and sometimes survival is just about patience, caution, and staying alive long enough to find safety. I drove into the woods late in the afternoon, the sun hanging low behind thick clouds that made the whole forest look darker than it was. The GPS signal kept cutting in and out, flickering with a stubborn warning that I was far from anything resembling a town. I hadn't realized how remote this cabin really was until I turned down the last dirt road, its ruts deep from rain and erosion. The tires of my car crunched over rocks and twigs as I slowed, the scent of wet earth and pine filling the car. I hadn't expected this place to feel so alive. Almost like the forest was holding its breath, waiting for me to arrive. The cabin itself looked smaller than it had online. I had chosen it because the pictures promised seclusion and a view of the lake behind it, and it had cheap rates for the off-season. The structure was simple, a rough rectangle of logs with a tin roof that reflected the last bits of sunlight. The windows were dusty, streaked with dirt, and the porch creaked under every step as I opened the door. Inside it smelled of old wood, must, and a faint trace of smoke. Nothing alarming, just the quiet kind of smell that comes from a place left alone for months. I dropped my bags and flicked the light switch, but nothing happened. No surprise, I had read the cabin ran on a generator that only worked for a few hours at a time. I grabbed a flashlight from my bag and swept it across the room. The furniture was minimal. A small kitchen table with 2 chairs, a couch with a threadbare cover, a bed in the corner with clean but plain sheets, and a wood stove. There was a pile of firewood stacked near the door. I made a mental note to start a fire before it got too dark. I unpacked quickly, then went outside to check the perimeter. The forest was quiet, eerily quiet. I could hear the faint rustle of leaves and the distant caw of a crow, but that was it. No cars, no people, just the occasional creak of a branch in the wind. I had been alone in the woods before, but this felt different. It wasn't peaceful. It was waiting. By the time I chopped some wood and started a fire, darkness had fully fallen. The cabin's interior glowed orange and flickered with shadows. I ate a simple dinner of canned beans warmed on the stove, the only sound the pop and crackle of the flames. Afterward, I settled onto the couch with a book, trying to ignore the heavy silence that pressed against the walls and windows. Every once in a while, I thought I heard something outside, just a faint snap or rustle, but I told myself it was just the forest shifting in the night. Hours passed. I was just starting to feel my eyelids grow heavy when I heard it. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then I realized it wasn't. It was a soft, deliberate scraping sound against the side of the cabin, low and slow, like someone or something was dragging a stick or tool along the wood. I froze. The flashlight lay on the table, useless on the couch. My stomach twisted and I strained my ears. The sound stopped, leaving the forest again silent. I tried to convince myself it was an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer, but it had been too precise, too steady. I grabbed my phone to check the signal, only to find none. No service, not even a bar. Great. I considered leaving, but my car was almost 20 minutes back up the rutted road, and the darkness outside made it impossible to navigate. I couldn't tell where the cabin ended and the forest began. I tried to calm myself, telling myself that whatever it was had to be outside and probably wouldn't be able to get in. Then I heard it again. This time it came from the back of the cabin. Slow, deliberate, heavy dragging. I could feel my heart hammer in my chest. I crept to the nearest window and pointed the flashlight toward the sound. Nothing. The beam swept across the blackened trees, catching shadows and leaves, but no figure, no movement. Just trees. Just darkness. I forced myself to breathe, my hand trembling as I held the flashlight. Minutes later, I heard a loud thump from upstairs. The cabin had a small loft over the main room, a single room with a bed and a chair. I hadn't gone up yet, and now I was terrified too. Every instinct screamed to run, but my body refused. The thump came again, followed by a dragging scrape along the floorboards above me. I realized with a sudden clarity that someone had to be up there. Or maybe something had found a way in through the back or the side. The thought of an intruder in a place with no locks or neighbors made my skin crawl. I did the only thing I could think of. I grabbed the hatchet from the kitchen. My hands were shaking as I approached the stairs, the beam of my flashlight bouncing with each step. Halfway up, I heard another thump. This time it sounded like it came from directly above me. I froze, holding my breath, straining to hear. Then the dragging sound moved toward the loft railing and stopped. I could sense it, whatever it was, just on the other side, waiting. Something inside me snapped. I turned and ran down the stairs toward the back door. I swung it open and stumbled into the cold night air. My breath came out in white clouds, and the forest pressed around me like a solid wall. I ran blindly toward where I thought my car was parked, tripping over roots and stones, cutting my hands on branches. Behind me, I heard heavy footsteps, but I didn't dare look back. I ran until my legs burned, until I could no longer hear anything at all. I reached the road, panting, my shoes soaked in mud, and started my car. I didn't check the rearview mirror. I just drove, not slowing until I hit the first highway sign, then kept going until lights appeared in the distance. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest gas station hours later, where I parked under the fluorescent lights, shaking, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I wanted to believe it was my imagination, some mixture of stress and isolation, but the deep cuts on my hands told me otherwise. Something had been in that cabin. Something that had followed me into the night, but had finally stopped somewhere back in the trees. I reported the cabin to the rental service the next morning, and they confirmed it had been closed for months due to previous break-ins. No one had lived there for a long time. There was no explanation for what I had experienced, except that someone had likely been squatting in the cabin waiting for someone to arrive, and I had stumbled right into their trap. The thought still chills me. Now, months later, I can remember the sounds with perfect clarity: the scrape against the wall, the thumps overhead, the dragging across the loft floorboards. I don't know who or what it was, but I learned something very real. The wilderness is not only beautiful and peaceful. It can also be dangerous, quiet in ways that lull you into a false sense of safety. And sometimes the scariest thing isn't supernatural or unreal, it's just human, waiting, patient and ready. I never went back to the woods, and I never will. I make sure now to check every cabin's history, to never travel alone, and to never underestimate how quickly a place that seems empty can become terrifyingly full. The forest keeps its secrets, and some of them are not meant to be tested. But at least I survived, and I made it out alive. I may never understand fully what happened that night, but the memory is sharp, and it reminds me every day. Some risks are simply not worth taking, and the woods are much older and much quieter than we are ready to admit.